My mother never told me how it happened. Her fall from grace. In high school, she was a beauty queen. Beautiful, popular, fun. We would look at her scrapbooks together, and for a few moments her eyes would shine, making her look more like the girls in the picture. Once, I asked her why she didn't have fun like that anymore. She stopped smiling and went back to the ironing. I was in high school when I learned the real story. How she had shocked everyone by coming up pregnant in her senior year. I was in college when I learned that my dad was not the father. He'd married my mom later to make an honest woman out of her. I was working at a shelter when I learned how she had paid for her respectability. How he'd beaten her up on her wedding night. How he'd knocked her down the stairs when she was 8 months pregnant with me. Somehow she forgave him. And they went on. But somewhere, from the fall of grace and her fall down the stairs, the light left my mother's eyes. I'll never get to ask her about it, though. 26 years later, after an argument with my father, she shot herself in the head. He's very successful. Everything he touches turns to gold. And I guess it just kind of went to his head. He used to be so funny and charming. He used to adore me. But now, he's just mean. Yesterday, he threw the credit card at me and said, right in front of his buddies, "Go buy 3 or 4 pairs of Gucci loafers and shut the fuck up." Well, I acted like I didn't even hear him. I just kept on smiling and held my head up high. A lady doesn't lower herself, you know. My name is Ann Butler, and I have been carried in the arms of angels. I was drinking a cup of coffee on the back porch of Butler Greenwood, the antebellum home that has been in my family for 8 generations. It was a peaceful morning. Just then, Murray Henderson drove up. Murray was the former warden of Angola prison, and also my husband. But we had never been happy together. And the week before, I had told him I needed some space. And he moved out. But I invited Murray in, and we sat on the porch. He didn't seem agitated or angry. But suddenly, without even raising his voice, he said, "You say you need some space? I'll give you some space." I looked up, and he was standing over me with a black .38 pistol. He shot me 6 times at close range. That's when the angels came. It's the only way I can explain it. 2 angels came and held me, so I did not struggle or scream. I just watched as the blood pooled in my lap and poured down the sides of my wicker chair. The angels helped me remain still as death, and Murray stopped shooting. Those angels saved my life. We would like to thank our friend Terrie Nix for agreeing to bring just a few of our stories to life for us tonight. If you think she looks familiar, you're right. Terrie served as the model for our piece entitled Gucci Loafers. Thank you so much for those dramatic readings, Terrie. My name is Terrie Queen Autrey. I am a writer, a social worker, and a teacher. I am also an activist. I have been passionate about the issue of domestic violence for almost 30 years. I've worked in various ways to raise awareness and funding for programs in virtually every place I've lived. In 1996, I was fortunate enough to meet Kate Sartor Hilburn, a visionary artist and photographer who was also passionate about this issue. Kate had some very exciting and distinct ideas about how to make art out of the things she'd learned about domestic violence. So we began our collaboration in 1999, and the journey that we've traveled has been vital and provocative. Before I share a few of my thoughts about that journey, though, I would like to thank the Art Institute, in particular Amy Dunn and Kim Resnick, for their work with us in bringing this show to the Atlanta area. I would also like to thank one of their most exciting alumni, Ed Richardson, for all of his help, both in support and in technical support. Kate and I are very excited about this show and this venue, and we are looking forward to seeing the ways in which the exhibit will be used to educate, to inform, and hopefully to inspire those who come to view it. I would also like to thank the Georgia Coalition Against Domestic Violence, as well as several local service providers in the field of domestic violence. The Women's Resource Center, Jewish Family and Career Services, Shalom Bayit, Peace in the Home, I just love that name, Raksha, and Men Stopping Violence for their partnership with us this month. I'm going to tell you why we like to have a partnership like that when we're giving talk and when we're giving the show. We have learned from previous shows that there's often a very intense emotional response to this exhibit. It's not uncommon for someone to read his or her story in our work. Our guest book, which we urge you to sign and give us your candid feedback, we'd love to have it, is filled with comments like, "You told my story," or "You must have been in my home." This may be attributed to the fact that so many of the themes that are reflected in our work are in some sense universal. For example, progressive isolation, as exhibited in the story The Window, or humiliation, as in Gucci Loafers, which Terrie just read, or The Stupid List, or control, as in the case of Emergency or A Woman's Glory. All of these are among top indicators of domestic violence and common themes in the relationship that contains violence. In other cases, a person may come to one of our shows and realize for the very first time that the relationship they are in is not normal. In fact, it's not acceptable. And this is often a revelation to the person, and I'm often going to say woman without discounting the fact that men too experience violence, but mainly the stories that we have are from women at this point. So a woman will tell us, he says that I'm so lucky to have him, or I'm so lucky he puts up with me, so I never really thought that it was anything but my problem. And I'll tell you a story like that. Years ago, we had this exhibit in Pensacola, Florida. A few years after that, I was in my favorite gift shop in Pensacola when someone came up to me. The owner of the shop came up to me. "You saved my life," she said. And her eyes were enormous, and her voice was so solemn, and I was quite frankly a little taken aback.
Then she went on to tell me that she had come with her mother to see the Beating Hearts exhibit. And as she walked around and read stories, she realized for the very first time ever that her marriage of 19 years was not typical, was not normal, was not healthy. And she said, I thought everyone had conflict like we did. I thought everyone resolved it the way we did. But as I kept reading the stories and walking through the exhibit, I started crying. I cried for 2 whole days, and then I got help. And that's one of the reasons why we like to have literature on hand at our show, because we want people who read it, read the stories, or see the exhibit to have immediate accessibility to local service providers. The organizations I mentioned just a moment ago have pamphlets, literature, and resource material available in the gallery. And we urge you to take it if you need it, give it to someone else if you know someone else who needs it. By all means, share that information so that someone who sees this or is living that kind of story will get the help that they need. Now I'd like to tell you a little bit about my personal journey with the exhibit Beating Hearts. I recently read a quote by Walter Lippmann. It says, "Art enlarges experience by admitting us to the inner lives of others." Well, this is such an apt description of the process involved in the creation of Beating Hearts, because the stories you see and read in the exhibit are all true. We have met the individuals. We have worked with them and talked with them, and they have shared their stories with us. So yes, we have been admitted into their inner lives. Some of them are our friends. Some of them are our family members. And yes, some of them are our own stories. We have received the gift of strong, authentic voices to use in our work, while the individuals whose stories we're telling have been given a voice, a means of validation, a way to tell their stories. That combination has been effective and potent for the survivors of domestic violence as well as for Kate and I as artists. And if the combination of survivors and artists has been powerful, let me say that the combination of a writer and a photographer has been equally strong. The collaboration between Kate Sartor Hilburn and me has allowed us to represent the truths in these stories in a much more vivid and meaningful manner than we would have done if we'd been working by ourselves. The photo constructions on their own would be very, very strong. The stories by themselves would be very, very moving. But when you put the two together, they impact the senses and the emotions, which is a much more forceful blend. There's a quote by John Ruskin that talks about that. He says, "Fine art is that in which the hand, the head, and the heart of humankind go together." And Kate and I believe that this is actually the best description of our collaboration. The physical process of creating these physical and symbolic pieces in order to affect awareness and hopefully inspire change involves all three of Ruskin's mandates for fine art. The final area I'd like to talk about before I sit down is the process of writing the stories for Beating Hearts. For the writing portion of the exhibit, I chose to select just one part of an individual's story and write it in first person vignette style, a very short, abbreviated episode in that person's life, and using their voice. And this presented some challenges. First of all, we might have talked to an individual for hours and heard any number of equally moving stories. Or we might know that individual and have known them for years and seen an even wider number of stories and episodes and dramas go by in their lives. So how do we choose which ones we're going to tell? How do I choose as a writer which one to relate? Well, the first thing that we often do is, if we've interviewed the person together, if we've met with them together, if we know them together, Kate and I might sit down and brainstorm together and say, which one thing that she told us hit you with the most force? And often it would be the very same thing. And in fact, many times Kate already had an idea, a visual image or a construction idea in mind for that story. And we might work it that way. In other occasions, I've written 6 or 7 vignettes from one person's life then give them to Kate, and Kate might choose which one of these she wishes to bring to visual form from that individual story. Another challenge that I've had in writing in someone else's voice is using someone else's voice in a genuine and authentic manner. It's been a priority to me to stay in the voice of the woman who told me the story. This means that if she uses incorrect grammar, I will. If she speaks in dialect, I try to. The only exception that I use with dialect is if the dialect is so strong that it will take away from the story itself. You know, in the book, The Color Purple by Alice Walker, when you first begin to read the book, or when I did, the dialect is so strong that you're almost trying to decipher what the language is as you read it. And that distracted me from the story for a little while, much more so than when I heard them speak it in the movie later. But you get to reading it, and after a little while, you adjust. It's just that in these vignette forms, you only have 2 paragraphs to adjust. And so that might not be long enough for a reader to assimilate. In those cases, as in the story The Stupid List, I had to choose to omit dialect. In The Stupid List, the woman came to our shelter from a very, very rural farming community outside of Ruston, which is already rural. And she spoke in such a thick, thick accent that if I had tried to write her story as she said it, I was too stupid to get a job. If I'd written it like that, I think it would have been indecipherable to the reader, and there's not enough time in a paragraph to get to understanding her form. So instead, I kept her words, but omitted her dialect. These were some of the challenges that I faced in the selection of writing of the true stories that I retold in this exhibit. Each time I read the stories, however, I do not think about the challenges involved in writing them. I think instead of that woman. I see the line of her face. I see the fear and the shame. I see the hurt. I see her eyes cast down. I see her mouth trembling, and I see her hands clasped into fists in her lap while she tries to tell me what she's lived through. In some of the lucky stories, I see her victorious smile when she sets herself free. I'd like to close with a comment about that. So many times after a show, people have come up to us and said, "You have to tell me what happened to her." So after a while, Kate and I decided that the stories needed endings. For those of you who have walked through and did not realize it, in the gallery, behind the metal doors on which the stories are now written, you will find an ending to the story. Simply turn the door on its hinge. Now I have to warn you, some endings are positive. She got free. She made it to safety. She started a new life. Some of them are not. The ending might be she left the shelter in the middle of the night and we never saw her again. We don't know what happened to her. Some of them, as in the story Terrie told, which is my mother's story, that she committed suicide 26 years later as a result of the ongoing struggles. What we are glad to say is that some is a victory, some is a success. Some of those people made it to safety, to shelter, and to a new life. And if Kate and I can say one thing that we desire more than or as much as the artistic expression we created from this exhibit, it would be that it might inspire more people to leave abuse behind and start a life of safety and strength. Thank you. And now I'd like to turn this over to my collaborator and friend, Kate Sartor Hilburn, who will share a little about the process of creating the photo constructions and the impact the work has had on her.
I realized as Terrie was talking that it's a huge mistake to follow a writer while giving a talk if you're not a professional speaker. But I'm glad to be here. I do want to thank the Art Institute of Atlanta for inviting us to exhibit Beating Hearts, Stories of Domestic Violence. I'm also grateful to Ed Richardson, who is an Art Institute graduate and independent producer in Atlanta, who assisted us by suggesting this venue and also for helping us install the exhibit. When I first conceptualized this body of work, I was getting my MFA in photography at Texas Women's University and volunteering at a domestic violence shelter in Dallas. At the time, I was really influenced by a book that we were reading by art theorist Susie Gablick called The Reenchantment of Art. In it, she is questioning the belief of many artists who saw art as an arena in which to pursue individual freedom and expression, the art for art's sake of the late modernist period, which kind of kept art as a specialized pursuit devoid of practical aims and goals. In its place, she proposed in this book that an expanded context that gives value to social and environmental factors and some sense of service to the whole. Postmodernism at that time, which was in 1991, was on the rise, and this movement occurring at the time that I had entered graduate school was really influential to me. I was aware of some of the other projects that were being done photographically with domestic violence, and I had seen some of the work exhibited and heard lectures by photographers who had been engaged in that work. And since I had been a shelter volunteer and as an artist, I felt really strongly that I had a project on domestic violence in me, and I began to seek questions that I would want my work to answer. First of all, what did I want to say about domestic violence? And to answer that question, I examined what I wished the viewer to understand when they saw the work, and I came up with about 3 things. One was information. I wanted people who saw the work to learn something about domestic violence. There's so much misinformation, and I found out that the average person knows really very little about domestic violence unless they're involved in it, and what they did know wasn't always factual. There are a lot of stereotypes associated with domestic violence and that are completely false. So that's why we did pieces like Why Women Stay, Myth versus Reality, The Cycle of Violence, and the Root of Domestic Violence. These are informational stories. And so along with the stories that we did of individual women, they represented aspects of domestic violence that were common to many situations. 35 years ago, when I was confronted by domestic violence in my own life, there wasn't even a name for it. There were no shelters, no counseling centers, no hotlines. Law enforcement had no guidelines. Legislators weren't aware or concerned, and a woman was on her own to deal with it. People use terms like, every day, rule of thumb, without realizing where the expression came from. It's an English law that stated that a man was not allowed to beat his wife with anything thicker than the diameter of his thumb. Today, I can have my say, using what I have, which is my artwork. Today, legislators have passed domestic violence laws and stalking laws. Today, television shows and movies are filled with domestic violence themes. And almost every community has some sort of domestic violence organization. Today, law enforcement has training and options to offer victims. Today, people are willing to speak out. These women are willing to share their stories. Secondly, I wanted to tell stories that revealed truth. I wanted to show aspects of domestic and dating violence through the stories that we had heard working as volunteers. I had seen projects done, for instance, in homeless shelters in which the photographer had made portraits of the homeless, and while I was moved by these portraits, I had a sense that the subjects were, by the mere action of being photographed, made a sort of object of scrutiny, being used in some way by the artist. I know that documentary photography itself is in the business of capturing subjects, revealing the unreported or the unknown. But in domestic violence, there's a victim, a person who is very vulnerable and even fearful. So I didn't feel comfortable using real victims, and so with the exception of 1 or 2 of the pieces, we used actors, friends, and other people that were willing to represent our storytellers. A couple of the pieces have real people who requested for us to represent their story and their own images in the pieces. The third thing I wanted was to evoke emotion. I wanted our audience to be moved to action, even if that action is only an evolved understanding that reveals itself in our own personal relationships, both our own and what you hear and what you read about. Sometimes when we know more, we can do more. Volunteering, listening, helping a friend, or supporting lawmaking that helps protect are all ways that we can help as individuals. And I hope that people who see the show will be moved. to make some of these actions happen. Artistically, the questions I wanted answered were more personal to my own work and style as a visual artist. Because the work was initiated 10 years ago, my way of working has evolved over time. Computer and digital imaging make it a lot easier to do what I was at first doing very challengingly, to create layers, enlarging images, or adding text. I now work almost completely with digital imaging and Photoshop. And in the beginning, I was still using film, my own darkroom, or service bureaus. From the beginning of the project, I thought about windows and doors as the framing concept. Windows and doors represent the framework of home, the entrance, the exit, looking out, looking in. They're what we close and lock up to keep danger out. Home is where we should feel the safest. In these stories, home is a battleground, a prison, or a minefield. I began to pick up windows and doors and found many of them in unusual places. I incorporated hinges, locks, pulls, and so forth as part of the pieces. No door or window in my neighborhood was safe. I begged, borrowed, and bought windows, and even used windows from the remodeling of my house. Terrie and I had decided on a number of women's stories, sometimes adding stories and sometimes eliminating one. Our criteria was based on making a balanced presentation of stories by people with a wide range of experience and cultures. Each story contains a theme that reflects some aspect of domestic or dating violence. As I mentioned before, I used models, actors, and friends to represent the people in the stories. I set up shots that I felt depicted the situation that each person described in their story. Sometimes the setup was quite literal, like in The Good Wife, where the woman is sitting in the doorway waiting for the man to finish his dinner. In others, the images were more metaphorical, such as in The Root of Domestic Violence, where a locked chest just barely contains the roots that are spilling out on the edges. I work intuitively, so having a story to inspire the visual work is a strong starting point for me. I've always incorporated layers of text or images in my work, and in this project, that was also true. At first, I relied on Xerox transparencies. There was a special place in Denton, Texas that could make really big ones, and I became really good friends with them. But as computer output became more and more sophisticated, I realized I was able to do on the computer what I had been struggling to invent in crazy ways. And now I use it mostly to accomplish layering and other things like that. Sometimes I built the boxes from scrap wood, as in Myth Reality, where the small windows are lit from behind. In other pieces, I repurposed window-like structures that are built onto the windows to structure the piece, as in The Cycle of Violence. At first, we had a collection of full-size doors. We do have one door in the exhibit now, which is a screen door with a little doggy door on it. But originally, we had 6 or 7 huge, heavy doors that were covered with the names of people who had been murdered in Louisiana in 1 year's time. And after hauling those doors around to a couple of cities, we retired them to the forest in front of my house. So if you ever come to visit me, you can see the doors of domestic violence are set up as an installation in the woods in front of my house. But a lot of things were really practical about trying to transport it when we realized we were, that it was getting kind of out of hand. We began to exhibit the first few pieces after they were done locally in our area, first at Louisiana Tech University, which is right where we live, and several times at fundraisers and candlelight vigils and other events. When the project grew and really became an exhibition on its own, we solicited different galleries, museums, and universities to exhibit the work. And so as we did this and took the went to different places, we began to be asked to loan the work to various organizations for conferences and events. But the show is just so unwieldy physically for any short-term exhibit. So we tried to figure out what to do about that. And what we did was apply for a grant to create a poster series based on beating hearts. And that poster series is displayed throughout the gallery and the hall here. And there are 12 different posters, which we loan out for free to organizations for short times. And we also sell the poster series to different people and organizations throughout the United States and Canada. And this has really expanded the visibility of the show, and it's made it cover a lot more ground. And so we've been real happy that we could do that. In the future, we're thinking about a book based on the exhibit, and possibly a documentary or a one-person show where one person would play the parts and tell the stories. So we're looking ahead to different ways to explore using the stories and using the artwork, and we do look forward to that. And I want to thank you for being here tonight and allowing us to show this work and share it with you. And we hope that you will write in the book in the gallery with your feedback. We welcome any kind of comments, negative or positive. And in fact, we love negative. We sit around and talk about it a lot afterwards. So thank you again for having us. We appreciate being here. The grant came from the Gannett Foundation, which is Gannett owns the two newspapers that are the largest ones around us, Shreveport Times and the Monroe News Star in our area. Yes. Sorry. We got a grant from the Gannett Foundation to create the posters, and so we had enough money from that grant to make about 3 sets of the posters, and it kind of went on from there. As we sell a set, we print a set.
And the proceeds go to our local domestic violence organization. So that's a really good thing for us to be able to, and as we get the money in, then we're able to get a new set
Yeah.
for the next person that wants to buy one.
Anybody else? Yes.
How do we get information about purchasing the posters?
Pick up our card. We have our card outside by the guest book.
Yes. It has. You can contact us by phone or by the website. We do have a website for Beating Hearts. It's beatinghearts.net, and has all the information. The poster series, if you buy the entire series, is $450. You can buy them individually for $40. There's 12 of them, and we do loan them out to organizations. We have some poster frames. We will mail them to you. If you pay the postage, we'll loan them to you. And anybody else?
One thing that's kind of neat about the poster series recently is that military bases are purchasing them, which, since law enforcement and the military are the two highest rate of domestic violence occupations, we're really excited to see the military purchasing these for their base family advocacy centers and things like that. So that's an exciting development.
Yes.
I wondered if maybe you had thought of reaching out via the posters or the exhibit to high schools and colleges, because clearly the cycle can start early. Either the parents have behaved that way, or for whatever reason. It seems like the younger you could get the message out, the better it would be.
Yes, I think that's a wonderful idea, and we do see that a lot. We're fortunate enough to have our local area covering high school domestic violence sort of education
and junior high.
And junior high. And one of the stories, particularly in this, has to do with dating violence. The folding piece that's on the table is a sort of a high school situation. But yes, it's exciting to think of all the different ways that it can be used, and we're anxious to do that. If anybody, has any kind of input like that, we pay close attention to that and want to do what we can.
Anybody else?
Thank you for being
We're
here.
so glad you came. Thank you very much.